Is God a delusion? Well, it's possible to be wrong about a lot of things in life, taking the wrong luggage from the carousel, eating the wrong piece of food by accident. But when it comes to the question of God, that's a big question, and it's one we don't want to be wrong about. It's possible to think that God is just a delusion because, after all, that seems to be what so many have been saying. Over the past decade, we've seen the writings of a number of prominent atheists that make this claim. For example, when you see Daniel Dennett's book, Darwin's Dangerous Ideas, you read something like this: "The kindly God who lovingly fashioned each and every one of us and sprinkled the sky with shining stars for our delight, that God is like Santa Claus, a myth of childhood, not anything a sane or undiluted adult could literally believe in." Or take, for example, the words of Christopher Hitchin in his books, God is Not Great, How Religion Poisons Everything. He says, Voltaire was simply ludicrous when he said that if God did not exist, it would be necessary to invent him. The human invention of God is the problem to begin with. And then, of course, there's Richard Dawkins, who's written many books, The God Delusion, in which he speaks about the very idea of God. And he says God, the Christian God he's speaking about, is a vindictive, bloodthirsty, ethnic cleanser, a misogynistic, homophobic racist, an infanticidal, genocidal, filicidal, etc., etc., and unleashes a tirade on the very idea that God might exist. Then, of course, Sam Harris, in his book Letters to a Christian Nation, says atheism is nothing more than the noises that reasonable people make in the presence of unjustified religious beliefs. Well, I want to ask the question, is it justifiable? Is it rational to believe that God exists? That's what we're going to look at for the next few moments together. Is belief in God a delusion? Well, the Oxford English Dictionary defines the word delusion as a belief or impression that's maintained despite being contradicted by reality or rational argument, typically as a symptom of a mental disorder. Well, that's quite a challenge to say that those who believe that God exists, those who have even personal faith in Him, are among those who are defending an undefendable belief, who are in fact mentally deranged. Well, let's see what things we can look at that give us confidence for belief. First I might point out that atheism does have its challenges, because in fact it becomes a position of having to prove the non-existence of God. And when I talk with students, sometimes I point out two things that are helpful to remember. Once in a while we'll draw a big circle on the board and say, let's imagine that circle represents all known knowledge. And then we ask the question, if we were to diagram how much of that known knowledge we possess, either as an individual or even as a classroom, how big a circle would we draw? And so the debate goes back and forth, but generally a fairly humble response is that it's not a very big circle. In fact, Einstein said that we possess probably less than 1/10 of 1% of all known knowledge. It makes the case that there's an enormous area that's, to us right now, ignorance. We don't know about it. And it's just possible that God exists in that place and that we haven't known Him, not because He doesn't exist, but because there's vast amounts of things that we don't know. The second thing that we look at in this is we talk sometimes about the dog delusion. And I would tell the story of coming on the dorm and floor and knocking on a door and asking someone if they have a dog in their room, and they might be able to confidently say, no, I don't have a dog in my room. But then I might ask, is there a dog on the floor somewhere? And they might say, I'm quite certain that there's not. But it's a bigger position because there's so much more they have to know. One might even ask the question, does it really matter? But I would say it matters more than almost anything, because this issue affects the big questions in life. Questions like, where did I come from? Why am I here? Where is history headed? How can I even know? These are the questions that really stem from the issue of whether there's a God who's behind it all or not. Another question that gets raised at times is, yeah, but can you prove that God exists? And that's a valid question. We need to remember that there's different types of proof. A better question might be, is there valid evidence? You see, when a young woman asks her young man to tell her or prove to her that he loves her, He might pull out a calculator and start working on a formula, but that wouldn't be too satisfying to her. In the same way, if that same young man begins his job as an engineer and is asked to demonstrate that a bridge will hold a certain load, and he begins to talk about his feelings and how he can't stop thinking about that bridge and how that bridge is in his mind all the time, well, that wouldn't be too satisfying to his boss either. You see, the right proof is needed for the right questions. The question, is God a delusion? There is evidence that we can look at. And here are 5 things, I believe, that are helpful to allow us to see that it is entirely reasonable to believe that God exists. The first is what we would call the cosmological evidence, or the first cause. A child riding with their parent in the car says, "Mommy, where did that come from?" And they're saying, "I see something that exists. It must have been caused by something. What was it?" Well, we observe the universe and say, it exists. Where did it come from? Classically, this has been formulated like this. 1, whatever begins to exist has a cause of its existence. 2, the universe began to exist. 3, therefore the universe has a cause for its existence. Now, many would say the most reasonable cause is an infinite being like God who has caused it to happen. However, there are alternatives to that conclusion. Some have said, no, the universe is eternal. It has no beginning. And that was a view held by many until the mid-20th century, but isn't taken seriously anymore. I recently heard a debate where a second view was put forward by a professor from the University of Colorado who said, well, the answer is that there are many universes, and ours is just a product of other universes, which is called the multiverse theory, and it's really one that doesn't answer the question because it just creates a problem of recession where we begin to have to go backwards and backward, but still there is a primary event. The third alternative often is that the universe does not actually exist, that it's an illusion, and this is more of a philosophical belief, and it's not typically satisfying to most. In 1970, a young man in Cambridge named Stephen Hawking published a paper that has now become the dominant view of all of science, and that is where we began to hear this term, the Big Bang. But he talks about all of time and space and matter had a beginning singularity event. And there is in it the agreement with what the Bible says, that in the beginning, there was a beginning, God created. The second argument is the teleological argument, or the argument from design. And it's really an argument that gets lots of attention from Dawkins because I think it's such a powerful argument, and it was formulated far back by people like William Paley in the 18th century, who talked about finding a watch in a field and realizing something with complexity and design must have belonged to someone else and must have been designed by someone intelligent. And this argument is just saying, as we come to understand more and more of our universe and our world, we realize that the complexity is so strong. One example would be from the words of the philosopher Anthony Flew, who was previously a very strong advocate of atheism, and in his book, There Is a God, How the World's Most Notorious Atheist Changed His Mind, he said this: perhaps the popular and intuitively plausible argument for God's existence is the so-called argument from design. According to this argument, the design that is apparent in nature suggests the existence of a cosmic designer. And although I was once sharply critical of the argument of design, I have since come to see that, when correctly formulated, this argument constitutes a persuasive case for the existence of God. Well, the Bible says that God created and designed and put the world in the place that it is. And the evidence, I believe, is there to point to that conclusion for those who would see it. There are many other interesting things that could be said under this title, including the fine-tuning of the universe, some of Fred Hoyle's and Alvin Plantinga's, and even Stephen Hawking's words on that. But we'll move on to the third area of evidence, is what we would call moral evidence. You know, if you hear children playing in the playground, someone will eventually call out, "Wait a minute, that's not fair." Well, who teaches children what's fair and what's not fair? You see, conscience means with knowledge. How is it that we have this knowledge of what's fair, what's evil, what's good? If we simply evolve, where does this sense of right and wrong come from? We should accept, we could even applaud tragedies, evil, that remove the weak. But something within us says, no, this is not right. The existentialist Jean-Paul Sartre, in a lecture given in Oxford in 1956, said this: "The existentialist finds it extremely embarrassing that God does not exist, for there disappears with him all possibility of finding values in an intelligible heaven. There can be no longer any good a priori, since there is no infinite and perfect consciousness to think it." As Dostoevsky said, if God does not exist, everything is permissible. As C.S. Lewis said, he argues that this conscience reveals to us a moral law whose source cannot be found in a natural world that has just evolved, but there must be a supernatural lawgiver. This is what the Bible says. Even though they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give him thanks. They became futile in their speculations, and their foolish heart was darkened. The writer of the Romans is saying that there's something in the heart of man that says there is right, there is wrong, there is good, there is evil. And that's one of the pointers, one of the evidences that says God exists. The evidence does point that direction. Don't give up so easily. The fourth piece of evidence that I'd like us to consider is the evidence of worship. You see, whatever part of the planet you go to, we find shrines, temples, idols, places of worship. They fill the earth. And I believe that that is an evidence. It points to something in the human soul that longs for something greater than itself. And again, as C.S. Lewis once said, if you found a key, you would logically say, isn't there a lock to which this fits? And when you see in the human heart a desire to worship, isn't this something that points to something else? I believe it is, and I believe that that's why we even see the emergence of atheistic worship centers, because people, even though they've denied the possibility of God, within themselves long for worship. They long for something greater. There's a book called God is Back, written in 2009 by Micklethwaite and Woolrich, and they just document the fact that man is a theotropic beast, as they call him, that rather than the diminishing of the religious instinct, it has mushroomed in the global population over the last many decades, and points to the fact that in what the Bible says is true, that God has made us for himself, and he has put eternity into our hearts. As Augustine said, you have made us for yourself, and our hearts are restless until they find their rest in you. This too, I believe, is an important piece of evidence. Fifth piece of evidence that I would add, to me, is the most important, and it's the person of Jesus Christ. The Bible has a book called John that was written by a man who at once was a skeptic but became a believer in Jesus. And in the beginning of his book, he begins with these words: "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God." And a little bit later he says, "The Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us, and we have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only Son from the Father, full of grace and truth." Potter ever meet J.K. Rowling? It's an interesting question. Well, the answer is only if J.K. Rowling made it happen. And here's the idea. Rowling would have to write herself into the story for the character to meet her. And this is what Christians believe, that God has written himself into our story. The most decisive piece of evidence about God is the person of Jesus Christ. You see, we believe God has come among us in the person of Jesus. When we consider his miracles, when we consider his claims, when we consider his resurrection, these are historical facts that we have to take seriously, and they're either true, and therefore God has visited the planet, or they're false, and therefore we can dismiss them wholeheartedly. The historian H.G. Wells said, "I'm a historian. I'm not a believer, but I must confess, as a historian, this penniless preacher from Nazareth is irrevocably the very center of his history. Jesus Christ is easily the most dominant figure in all history." We need to take that seriously and say, is this true? And if so, what does it mean? Well, as we come to a close, there's so much more that I would like to say about Jesus, but this is just looking at the evidence that it's reasonable to believe God exists. N.T. Wright, the theologian and historian, in his book Simply Christian, says this: in Jesus we are allowed to see finally whose voice has echoed throughout history, and who all these clues point to, and how we can know him. God can be known. It changes everything. It changes the questions that we can answer. It changes the hope that we can have. And in Jesus we find fully that confident assertion that God has come among us. Well, we considered 5 pieces of evidence that say it is reasonable. It's not a delusion, but it is a reasonable conclusion to believe that God exists. The great mathematician, father of the modern computer, Blaise Pascal, once said that there is enough light for those who want to see, but enough darkness for those who don't. I encourage you, if you seek, you will find. And what we find is, at the bottom of it all, is solid evidence for the existence of God. The big reasons that it matters is because it reminds us that we're here for a purpose. We were made by God, and that He's made us for a purpose, and He's made us for a destiny. And it's possible to know what that is, and we find that primarily in coming to know the person of Jesus Christ. I'd love to talk to you more about this personally. Feel free to email me at dan.rutherford@gmail.com.